You ever notice how people get real quiet when the truth gets too close to the surface? Funny thing about people, they can hide their opinions, they can fake their smiles, they can pretend they don't care, but eventually somebody slips, somebody says too much, somebody reveals what they were never supposed to reveal, and maybe that's exactly what happened with you. Two people knew something about you that they thought they could keep between themselves, but one of them cracked. Not because you forced them, not because you begged for answers. They cracked because watching you change made it harder to keep pretending they didn't notice. Your silence became suspicious. Your distance became uncomfortable. Your progress started asking questions they didn't have answers for. And now you're sitting here wondering what they actually said, what they really think about you, and why they couldn't hide it anymore. Because here's the part nobody likes to admit. People talk differently about you when you're not in the room. They reveal feelings they would never say to your face. Jealousy sounds different when it's whispered. Respect sounds different when pride gets removed. Fear sounds different when someone realizes you are no longer the person they used to control. And those two people may have been watching you far more closely than you ever realized, noticing every little change, every boundary, every unanswered message, every time you stopped explaining yourself, every moment you chose yourself instead of chasing their approval. And one of them finally said something that exposed everything they had been trying to hide about the way they see you, the way they compare themselves to you, and the reason your transformation has been bothering them so much. People are funny. When they think they have control over a secret, they hold it carefully, protect it, pass it between whispers, hide it behind innocent conversations, and convince themselves that nobody will ever know. But secrets have a strange habit of becoming heavier the longer people carry them. Eventually, somebody gets tired, somebody gets emotional, somebody gets careless, and suddenly the truth doesn't walk into the room politely. It falls out of someone's mouth like an accident they wish they could take back. Maybe that's what happened around you. Maybe one of those people finally slipped, not because you confronted them, not because you demanded answers, not because you stood there begging to know what they had been saying behind your back. No, it happened because your presence changed the pressure in the room. You became different, and they didn't know how to react to the difference. That's the part people don't understand about transformation. You don't always have to announce that you're changing. You don't need a dramatic speech. You don't need to post every achievement or explain every decision. Sometimes the loudest evidence is the person who suddenly stops behaving normally around you. They hesitate, they watch, they become strangely curious. They ask questions that sound casual but aren't. They notice things they used to ignore. And when you don't give them the information they're searching for, their imagination starts doing the work for you. That's where people become interesting. They start filling empty spaces with their own assumptions. They start creating stories about why you've become quieter, why you don't react the same way, why you don't chase conversations anymore, why you don't need the same validation you once needed. And somewhere inside those stories is the version of you they are struggling to accept. Maybe they thought you were predictable. Maybe they thought you would always explain yourself. Maybe they believed you needed their approval. Maybe they were comfortable with the old version of you, because that version made them feel important. Then something changed. You stopped giving them the reaction they expected, and suddenly they had nothing to hold on to. That's when people start talking. Not always because they hate you. Sometimes because they don't understand you anymore. Sometimes curiosity disguises itself as criticism. Sometimes insecurity disguises itself as jokes. Sometimes admiration hides behind a sarcastic comment because admitting respect would bruise someone's ego. And sometimes a person says something about you that reveals far more about themselves than it ever reveals about you. Imagine the moment. A conversation is happening. Your name comes up. Someone makes a comment. Maybe it's supposed to be harmless. Maybe it's supposed to sound dismissive. But then another sentence follows. And that second sentence changes everything. Because suddenly you realize they weren't ignoring you. They were paying attention. They knew more about your habits, your decisions, your progress. your silence, your boundaries than someone who supposedly didn't care should know. That's the little crack in the wall. That's the moment the performance starts falling apart. They can pretend they don't care, but attention leaves fingerprints. People reveal what matters to them by what they remember. They remember your mistakes when they want to feel superior. They remember your victories when they secretly compare themselves to you. They remember the moment you walked away, because they didn't expect you to actually do it. They remember the day you stopped arguing. They remember the day you stopped asking. They remember the moment you became comfortable being misunderstood, and then they wonder why you're different. Different. Of course you're different. You're supposed to be. You would have to be asleep to remain exactly the same after everything you've experienced. But here's the uncomfortable part. Some people only recognize your growth after it makes them uncomfortable. They don't notice the months you struggled quietly. They don't notice the nights you questioned yourself. They don't notice the discipline it took to stop reacting. They only notice the finished version because that's the version standing in front of them now. And when they can't explain it, they talk about it. When they can't control it, they analyze it. When they can't compete with it, they criticize it. Then someone gets emotional, someone gets careless, someone wants to prove they know something, and suddenly the secret isn't a secret anymore. One sentence escapes, one confession slips through, one person says what everyone else was apparently too proud to say, and suddenly you realize the people who claimed they weren't paying attention had been paying attention the entire time, just waiting for a moment when they could make sense of the person you became without having to admit that maybe your change had nothing to do with them. Maybe you didn't become colder. Maybe you simply became harder to manipulate, harder to distract, harder to impress, harder to pull back into the version of yourself they were comfortable with. And that's exactly why that little confession can hit so differently. Because sometimes the most revealing thing a person can tell you isn't what they said about you. It's how much they had been watching you before they finally said it. People are remarkably good at hiding what they feel until their emotions become too heavy to carry. They smile when they are irritated, laugh when they are jealous, pretend not to care when they are deeply curious, and act completely unaffected while secretly keeping track of every little thing you do. That's the funny part about human behavior. The mouth can say one thing while the eyes, the timing, the tone, and the reactions tell an entirely different story. And sometimes all it takes is one careless confession to expose the entire performance. One sentence, one reaction, one moment when somebody forgets they are supposed to pretend. Suddenly, the mask slips just enough for you to see what was underneath. Maybe you've experienced that moment already. Someone casually mentioned your name and suddenly another person became defensive. Someone brought up your progress and the room became strangely quiet. Someone joked about how different you've become, but the joke carried too much truth inside it. That's how hidden feelings usually escape. They don't arrive wearing a sign that says jealousy, insecurity, admiration, resentment, or respect. They disguise themselves as comments, jokes, criticism, curiosity, or unnecessary opinions. People rarely say, "Your growth makes me uncomfortable." Instead, they say, "You've changed." They rarely say, "I notice you more than I want to admit." Instead, they ask why you've been so quiet. They rarely say, "I respect what you're becoming." Instead, they find a tiny flaw to point at because admitting respect feels too expensive for their ego. And that's where you have to pay attention. Not to the words alone, but to the emotion hiding behind them. Because words can be rehearsed. Reactions usually aren't. Someone can prepare an answer, but they can't always prepare their face when your name enters the conversation. They can claim they don't care, but they can't always explain why they remember every detail about what you're doing. They can pretend your absence means nothing, yet somehow they know exactly when you stop showing up. They can tell everyone you're not important, while constantly bringing you into conversations you weren't even part of. Strange, isn't it? The person who supposedly doesn't care somehow has the most information. That's not always hatred. Sometimes it's fascination. Sometimes it's comparison. Sometimes it's insecurity. Sometimes people are simply trying to understand how someone they once underestimated became someone they can no longer predict. You might have been easier to understand before. You reacted quickly. You explained yourself. You answered every question. You wanted people to understand your intentions. You wanted to prove that you were right. You wanted everyone to know your side of the story. And then something happened. You got tired. Not weak tired. Tired of explaining obvious things. Tired of defending every decision. Tired of giving people access to your thoughts when they had already decided what they wanted to believe. So you became quieter. And silence creates a problem for people who are used to reading you. They don't know what you're thinking anymore. They don't know what you're planning. They don't know whether you noticed their behavior. They don't know whether you care, and uncertainty makes people reveal themselves. They start talking more because they want information. They start asking indirect questions. They start testing your reactions. They start mentioning things just to see if your face changes. They want proof that they still have some influence over you. But when you remain calm, the game becomes boring for them. Then somebody eventually gets frustrated. Somebody says too much. Somebody reveals that they were paying attention all along, and suddenly the confession isn't really about you anymore. It's about the person who couldn't keep their emotions under control. That's the beautiful irony of it. They thought they were revealing something about you, but they accidentally revealed themselves. They showed how closely they had been watching. They exposed what bothered them. They exposed what impressed them. They exposed what they compared themselves against. They exposed which version of you they preferred and which version they couldn't handle. And maybe that's why the confession feels so strange. Because you weren't asking for it. You weren't hunting for it. You weren't standing outside the door trying to hear what people were saying. You were simply living your life, and eventually reality became too uncomfortable for someone to keep pretending. The person who claimed you weren't important suddenly had an opinion about everything you were doing. The person who claimed you had changed for the worse somehow knew exactly how much you had changed. The person who said they didn't care somehow had the longest explanation. And that's when you learn something valuable about people. Sometimes the intensity of their reaction tells you more than the content of their words. Especially when they become unusually emotional about someone they insist doesn't matter, because if you truly meant nothing to them, they wouldn't need such a complicated explanation for why they supposedly don't care. Silence is a strange thing. People think silence means nothing is happening, but sometimes silence is exactly what makes everything happen. When you stop explaining yourself, people start explaining you for you. When you stop defending every decision, they start creating reasons for your decisions. When you stop telling everyone what you're thinking, suddenly everyone becomes interested in what might be happening inside your head. Funny, isn't it? You can spend years talking, proving, clarifying, answering questions, giving people every little detail about who you are, and somehow they still misunderstand you. Then you say nothing for a while, and suddenly they become detectives of your personality. They start asking other people about you. They start wondering why you disappeared from certain conversations. They notice that you don't respond the way you used to. They notice that you're not chasing attention anymore. They notice that you don't argue when somebody tries to provoke you. And the most entertaining part is that they often believe your silence is weakness, because they don't understand what happens when a person finally stops wasting energy on things that don't deserve it. Your silence didn't make you invisible. It made you unpredictable. And unpredictable people are difficult to control. They can't easily guess your next reaction. They can't tell whether you're angry, indifferent, focused, amused, disappointed, or simply too busy building something they haven't seen yet. So they talk. They fill the empty space with assumptions because uncertainty makes people uncomfortable. Maybe they say you've become arrogant. Maybe they say you're acting different. Maybe they say you've forgotten everyone. Maybe they create some beautiful little story about how you've changed, because they need an explanation that doesn't force them to look at themselves. Because admitting that you changed through discipline is harder than saying you changed. because you think you're better than everyone. Admitting that you became calmer because you've learned from your mistakes is harder than calling you cold. Admitting that you stopped chasing people because you finally respect your own time is harder than saying you don't care anymore. People often choose the explanation that protects their ego, and your silence gives them plenty of room to invent one. That's why silence can be so powerful. Not because silence magically controls other people, but because it removes the information they were using to predict you. You stop announcing your plans. You stop explaining every move. You stop giving emotional reactions to every little comment. You stop telling people what hurts you. You stop showing them exactly where the buttons are. And suddenly they have to guess. They don't like guessing. They liked the old arrangement. They knew what would make you angry. They knew what would make you respond. They knew how to pull you into arguments. They knew which words would make you defend yourself for 30 minutes. Then one day, they say the same thing, and you simply look at them. Nothing, no explosion, no speech, no desperate attempt to prove your worth, just silence. That's when they start questioning themselves. Did you hear me? Did you understand what I meant? Are you angry? Are you planning something? Do you not care anymore? The mind starts creating noise because you gave them none, and that noise can become louder than anything you could have said. Eventually, somebody talks too much. Someone tries to explain what you supposedly think. Someone tells another person that you're different now. Someone starts discussing your behavior as if they've been assigned a full-time position studying your life. And there it is. The contradiction. They claim you're irrelevant while spending energy discussing you. They claim you don't matter while noticing every change. They claim they have moved on while somehow knowing exactly what you've been doing. Your silence exposes that contradiction without you having to say a single word. But don't misunderstand this. Silence isn't about playing games. It's not about pretending you don't care just to make somebody chase you. That's another form of dependence. Real silence is simpler. It's when you genuinely stop needing everyone to understand you. You don't become quiet to manipulate people. You become quiet because you've realized not every misunderstanding deserves a correction. Not every accusation deserves a response. Not every opinion deserves your energy. And once you understand that, something changes inside you. You become selective. Your words become fewer but heavier. Your attention becomes harder to purchase. Your emotions stop being public property. And people who were comfortable with having unlimited access to you suddenly notice the door has become smaller. That's when some of them start talking more. They want to know what happened. They want to know who influenced you. They want to know why you're not reacting. They want to know whether you've noticed them. They want evidence that they still occupy space in your mind, but your silence gives them nothing to work with. So they create something. They speculate. They discuss. They interpret. They turn your quietness into a mystery because they can't stand an empty page. And sometimes, while trying to explain your silence, they accidentally reveal how much attention they've been giving you all along. They mention details they shouldn't know. They remember moments they supposedly forgot. They reveal opinions they claimed they never had. They talk about your habits, your progress, your choices, your distance, your attitude, and suddenly you realize the quiet person wasn't the one being mysterious at all. The people watching were the ones revealing themselves, because while you were busy saying less, they were busy saying far too much. People love to pretend they don't notice change until the change becomes impossible to ignore. They can watch you struggle and say nothing. They can watch you rebuild yourself quietly and still act like nothing is happening. They can watch you become more disciplined, more private, more focused, more comfortable with yourself. And then suddenly one day they look at you differently. Not because you announced anything. Not because you stood in front of them and declared that you're a new person. You simply stopped behaving like the version of you they had become comfortable with. That's when people start paying attention. The funny part is they were probably paying attention long before you realized it. They noticed when you stopped responding immediately. They noticed when you stopped explaining your choices. They noticed when you started protecting your time. They noticed when you stopped chasing conversations that felt forced. They noticed when you became less interested in proving that you were right. They noticed the small things because transformation rarely arrives with fireworks. Most of the time, it arrives quietly. One habit disappears. One boundary appears. One reaction gets replaced by patience. One bad pattern becomes boring. One old relationship loses its grip. And suddenly the person standing in front of them isn't as easy to predict anymore. That's uncomfortable for people who were attached to the old version of you. Maybe they knew exactly how to get your attention before. Maybe they knew what would make you angry. Maybe they knew how to make you doubt yourself. Maybe they knew that if they criticized you enough, you'd spend an hour explaining why they were wrong. Then you stopped. You didn't become emotionless. You became selective. That's a completely different thing. You still feel things, but you no longer feel obligated to display every feeling. You still notice disrespect, but you don't always respond to it. You still hear criticism, but you don't automatically treat every opinion like a verdict. And that shift can confuse people because they were familiar with your reactions, not your restraint. So they watch, quietly. They observe your choices. They notice your new habits. They wonder why you're not talking about your plans. They wonder why you seem comfortable without constant attention. They wonder why you don't seem desperate to prove that you're doing well. And because you don't give them the answers, they start creating their own. Some will call it arrogance. Some will call it distance. Some will say you've changed too much. Some will pretend they don't care while secretly comparing their progress to yours. That's how people sometimes protect their pride. They criticize the transformation they secretly recognize, because saying, "You've become stronger," can feel like admitting, "I underestimated you." Saying, "You're disciplined now," can feel like admitting, "I don't have the same influence over you." Saying, "You've really changed," can sound innocent, but sometimes it carries the weight of someone realizing that the old access they had to you is gone. And when people lose access, they often become curious about the person behind the new boundaries. They start looking for cracks. They test your patience. They bring up old memories. They remind you of mistakes you made years ago. They try to pull you back into familiar conversations because familiarity makes them comfortable. But if you don't return to the old pattern, they have to face something uncomfortable. Maybe the transformation is real. Maybe this isn't a phase. Maybe you actually learned something. Maybe you finally understood that peace is more valuable than being understood by everybody. And that's when their observations become obvious. Someone mentions your name when you're not around. Someone comments on how quiet you've become. Someone asks why you don't hang around like before. Someone jokes that you've become too serious. Someone wonders where you get the confidence. Someone notices that you no longer seek approval from the same people. And all these little comments create a picture. They were watching. They just didn't want you to know they were watching. Not necessarily because they were plotting anything dramatic, but because admitting that they noticed your growth would force them to acknowledge that something about you changed in a way they didn't expect. The most interesting part is that your transformation doesn't require their approval. You don't need them to congratulate you. You don't need them to understand your reasons. You don't even need them to admit that they were wrong about you. Let them watch. Let them wonder. Let them create theories if they need to. Because the person who is genuinely rebuilding their life doesn't spend all day checking who noticed. The work becomes more important than the audience. And eventually, the people who once ignored the process start discussing the result. They didn't see the early mornings. They didn't see the discipline. They didn't see the moments when you wanted to quit and didn't. They didn't see how many times you had to choose the harder option when nobody was watching. They only see the version that survived all of that. Then they call it sudden. They call it luck. They call it attitude. They call it a personality change. Anything except what it really was, 1,000 quiet decisions that slowly turned you into someone they could no longer recognize. And maybe that's why one careless confession can reveal more than years of conversation. Because when somebody finally admits they noticed your transformation, They're also admitting they had been watching the entire process from a distance, even while pretending they didn't care. People are obsessed with secrets. They imagine that the hidden information is always the most important part, as if discovering what someone said about you will suddenly explain everything. But sometimes the secret isn't the interesting part, the reaction is. Watch what happens when your name enters a conversation. Watch who becomes defensive. Watch who suddenly becomes quiet. Watch who laughs too quickly. Watch who changes the subject. Watch who suddenly has a very detailed opinion about you despite claiming they haven't thought about you in months. That's where the real story begins. Because people can control their words when they have time to prepare them, but reactions often arrive before the performance has time to begin. And that's why one person's reaction can tell you more than 100 explanations. Maybe they said you were nothing special. Fine, words are cheap. Maybe they said you've changed. Fine, everybody changes. Maybe they claim they don't care what you're doing. Fine. Then why did their expression change when someone mentioned your progress? Why did they suddenly become interested in details they supposedly didn't know? Why did they feel the need to explain themselves? That's the part that matters. The contradiction. People reveal themselves through contradictions more often than through confessions. They say they don't care, then keep checking. They say you're irrelevant, then keep discussing you. They say you've become arrogant, but what they really mean might be that you stopped seeking their approval. They say you've changed, but what bothers them might be that you no longer react according to the old script. They say you've become distant, but perhaps you simply stopped making yourself available to people who only valued you when you were easy to reach. And suddenly the conversation isn't about your personality anymore. It's about access. Who still has access to you? Who expects you to respond? Who believes they can still influence your emotions? Who gets uncomfortable when you don't explain yourself? That's where people become very honest without realizing they're being honest. Because when someone feels their influence disappearing, they often start testing the boundaries. They may make a small comment, then another. They might tease you about your silence. They might bring up your past. They might mention something you did months ago just to see if you still react. And if you remain calm, they learn something. They learn that the old version of you isn't available on demand anymore. That's not cruelty. That's growth. You don't owe everyone the same version of yourself forever. You are allowed to become more selective. You're allowed to outgrow conversations. You're allowed to stop participating in arguments that lead nowhere. You're allowed to decide that some people don't need access to every thought in your head. But when you do that, some people will interpret your boundaries as an insult because they were comfortable when you had none. That's why their reaction becomes the real confession. Not because every negative reaction means jealousy, and not because every strange comment is proof that somebody secretly hates you. Sometimes people are simply confused. Sometimes they're concerned. Sometimes they don't know how to interact with the new version of you. But sometimes the reaction is far too emotional for the situation. A simple boundary produces an argument. A small success produces sarcasm. Your silence produces accusations. Your confidence produces suspicion. Your independence produces questions. That's when you should pay attention, not because you need to become paranoid, but because patterns matter. One reaction can be meaningless. Repeated reactions are information. If the same person repeatedly becomes uncomfortable whenever you grow, whenever you become confident, whenever you stop seeking approval, then maybe the issue isn't your behavior. Maybe your behavior is simply revealing something they were trying not to confront in themselves. That's the uncomfortable mirror of personal growth. Your progress can remind somebody of what they haven't done. Your discipline can expose their excuses. Your peace can expose their chaos. Your boundaries can expose how much they depended on your availability, and you don't have to attack them for that. You don't even have to mention it. Just keep moving. Because the moment you start trying to prove that their reaction means something, you give the reaction power. You don't need to decode every facial expression or analyze every conversation. That's another trap. The goal isn't to become obsessed with who is watching you. The goal is to become so grounded that watching doesn't matter. Let them have their opinions. Let them misunderstand. Let them discuss the old you. Let them argue about whether you've changed. Meanwhile, you keep building the version of yourself they haven't met yet. Because the most satisfying thing about transformation isn't hearing someone admit they were wrong. It's reaching the point where their admission doesn't change how you see yourself. You don't need their confession to validate your progress. You don't need their approval to confirm your worth. You don't need them to explain why they reacted strangely when your name came up. Their reaction belongs to them. Your direction belongs to you. And once you understand that difference, you stop chasing hidden meanings and start watching behavior. You stop asking, "What did they say about me?" and start asking, "What does their behavior tell me about the relationship?" That's a much more useful question. Because words can be manipulated. Behavior is harder to edit. A person can say they're happy for you while constantly minimizing your achievements. They can say they support you while making every success feel like something you need to defend. They can say they don't care while repeatedly bringing you into conversations. They can say you've changed while never acknowledging why you had to change in the first place. And sometimes, without any dramatic confession at all, the pattern tells you everything you actually need to know about where you stand, what they expect from you, and why your silence has become so much louder than anything you could have said. There's something almost amusing about the way people describe you after you stop being the person they remember. They reach for old stories because old stories are comfortable. They talk about the mistakes you made, the things you used to care about, the reactions you used to have, because the past gives them a version of you they can still understand. But then they accidentally say something that gives everything away. They mention how disciplined you seem now. They mention how quiet you've become. They mention that you don't argue like you used to. They mention that you don't chase people anymore. They mention that you seem different, and suddenly the sentence they thought was criticism becomes evidence. Because if they truly hadn't noticed your change, they wouldn't have anything to describe. They wouldn't know what disappeared. They wouldn't know what replaced it. They wouldn't know which version of you they preferred. Yet somehow they know. They know because they were paying attention. Maybe they noticed when you stopped responding immediately. Maybe they noticed when you stopped asking for permission. Maybe they noticed when you started protecting your time instead of giving it away to anyone who demanded it. Maybe they noticed when you stopped explaining every decision as if your life required a committee vote. And that's the strange thing about growth. The people who were comfortable with the old you sometimes become the most vocal when the old you stops showing up. They don't always say, "I miss the version of you I could influence." They say, "You've changed." They don't always say, "I don't know how to control this version of you." They say, "You're acting different." They don't always say, "Your confidence makes me question myself." They say, "You think you're better now." The words are different, but the emotion underneath them can be remarkably similar. And you don't need to attack that emotion. You don't need to expose anyone. You don't need to gather evidence and confront the entire room, like you're solving some ridiculous mystery. That's the trap. The moment you become obsessed with proving what people said about you, you start giving their opinions more importance than your own direction. Let them talk. People talk when they are confused. People talk when they are impressed. People talk when they are insecure. People talk when they are bored. People talk when they don't know how to approach someone anymore. Not every conversation is a conspiracy. Not every strange reaction means someone secretly hates you. But when the same themes keep appearing, you can learn from them. If multiple people notice that you've become calmer, maybe you really have become calmer. If they notice you don't react as quickly, perhaps your emotional discipline is showing. If they say you're harder to reach, maybe you've finally stopped giving everyone unlimited access to your attention. And here's the part that can make people uncomfortable: you don't have to become louder to prove that you've changed. In fact, sometimes the strongest evidence is what you no longer do. You don't argue over every insult. You don't explain every rumor. You don't chase every person who walks away. You don't announce every plan before you've built anything. You don't need applause for every small victory. You don't need to convince strangers that you're becoming better. You simply keep going. That's why the things people say about you can become a strange kind of mirror. They show you what your behavior looks like from the outside. Not every opinion will be accurate, of course. People see through their own experiences, biases, expectations, and emotions. But sometimes criticism contains information you can use. Maybe you've become too guarded. Maybe you've become so focused that you've forgotten to communicate with people who genuinely care. Maybe your boundaries are healthy, or maybe you're using them as an excuse to avoid difficult conversations. Growth doesn't mean assuming every criticism is jealousy. That's childish. Real strength is being able to listen without becoming controlled by what you hear. You take what is useful. You discard what is noise. You keep moving. And that is where the transformation becomes real. Not when people admit you've changed, but when you no longer need their admission. Not when someone finally says, "I was wrong about you," but when being right stops being important. Not when the people who underestimated you finally respect you, but when their respect is no longer the fuel behind your effort. Because if your motivation depends on proving people wrong, they're still controlling your direction. Think about that. You can spend years trying to become successful just so someone who doubted you will regret doubting you. And then what? You finally succeed, they finally notice, and you discover you've been carrying their opinion all the way to the finish line. That's not freedom. That's revenge wearing a suit. Real freedom is different. You build because you believe in the work. You improve because you respect the person you could become. You become disciplined because chaos became too expensive. You become private because not everyone deserves a front row seat to your life. You become selective because your attention finally has value to you. And when people talk about that version of you, their words become background noise instead of instructions. Maybe one of those two people did confess something. Maybe they admitted they were surprised by your change. Maybe they admitted they didn't expect you to become this disciplined. Maybe they admitted they underestimated you. Maybe they revealed that they still think about the person you used to be. Whatever they said, don't let the confession become your new addiction. Don't spend the next 6 months wondering who said what, why they said it, or whether they're still talking. That's exactly how you lose the advantage you created through your growth. Let the information pass through you. Learn what it teaches you, then return to your life. Because the funniest part is that while they may still be discussing the version of you they used to know, you're already becoming someone they haven't figured out yet. And by the time they finally find the right words to describe you, you may have already changed again, leaving them with another version of the story they thought they had finally understood, another assumption that no longer fits. Another old description that becomes useless the moment you decide your future is more interesting than their opinion of your past.